The hardest occupation in the world today is not being a rocket scientist. It's not being a garbage man, it's not working construction all day, and it's not being an employee at Walmart. No, the hardest job in the world today is that of being a parent. Raising children is no small feat. You have to feed them, water them, give them enough sunlight, and make sure they stay alive until they reach adulthood. A common practice many parents use to get through these challenging moments is to read bedtime stories. These stories vary from classic Disney fairy tales to completely made-up stories conjured out of one's mind. Some of the stories you remember most may be ones told to you by your parents as you drifted off to sleep. My parents read stories to me when I was growing up. My mom, being the more responsible parent, read to us from the Children's Bible, which, though I take no pride in saying this, is still where lots of my biblical knowledge comes from. My father's method of storytelling was more of the made-up kind, or classic fairy tales. There was a story that lasted for years that consisted of a house with unlimited rooms that each contained a different theme and adventure. The stories of Cinderella, Robin Hood, and Winnie the Pooh all come from the earliest days of my childhood. When I think of stories, these are the times I remember. As I grew up, learning new stories never seemed to stop. But instead of romantic and adventurous fairy tales, they were stories of real people. They were stories of real events. They were true stories of history. It quickly became apparent to me that many of the inspirational, awe-inspiring, and unique stories I came across were never told, never talked about, never learned from. There are, in the vast history of the world, unforgettable tales that many people have never even heard of. I came across one such story stuffed into the footnotes of a novel about the early accomplishments of a young man named Walter Scott. On October 28, 1817, a royal warrant was given to a young Scottish historian by the name of Walter Scott. This warrant gave Scott permission to search for the missing Scottish crown jewels. The crown jewels, or honours of Scotland, include the crown, the sceptre, and the sword of state. The crown was worn by Mary Queen of Scots at her coronation in 1542. When the armies of Oliver Cromwell began to take control of Britain in 1653, the crown jewels were put in a chest and locked away until a safer time. The only problem was that nobody could remember where they had been hidden. A simple crown might not signify that much to us in America, where we look beyond the symbolic meaning of sparkling monarchical jewelry, but for Scotland there existed in the crown jewels a part of their very identity as a country. For years this piece of their legitimacy had been missing, and with the loss of the crown jewels meant the loss of the very heart of Scotland, and their right to independently coexist with the rest of the United Kingdom. Walter Scott, a young novelist who enjoyed writing poetry, decided it was time to find them. On a blustery day in February of 1818, Walter and a search party entered the dark and mysterious Edinburgh Castle. As they searched the rooms of the castle, using only ancient historical accounts as their guide, Scott and his men opened a closet and, upon opening, found the chest that contained the honours of Scotland. Since this discovery, they have been on display at Edinburgh Castle and are seen by millions of people, both in Scotland and around the world. Walter Scott who soon after this discovery became Sir Walter Scott, was just a normal person who enjoyed putting pen to paper and discovering the roots of his remarkable country. His whole life was spent in the pursuit of remembering and honouring the past. His knowledge of his country and his dedication restored Scotland to their medieval glory. Stories have power. They touch us in ways that textbooks can't. They fulfill our innate desire to connect with people who have the same struggles and lives as we do. Just like my ability to remember the stories I was told as a child, stories stick with us far longer than the mandatory memorized dates from our history classes. Often stories don't just affect people personally. There are stories that have the ability to affect entire nations and even the world. There exists in the ancient story that has accomplished this great feat of influencing the world. It's not a fairy tale, and it's certainly not a romance either. In 1144, at the height of a brutal and bloody civil war between the grandchildren of William the Conqueror over who held the right to the throne, the body of a young boy was found in Norwich, England. The boy had been brutally murdered, with strange wounds to his head, arms, and torso. Finding such horrible scenes was not uncommon due to the raging war that happened all around. In East Anglia, where Norwich is located, the war was particularly violent. Soldiers hung men and women by their thumbs for extortion. Others met a different fate of having knotted ropes put round their heads and twisted till they penetrated to the brains. That boy was discovered to be William of Norwich. His uncle, a priest, had two choices to make. The first to assume that William had been caught in the chaos of the ongoing war and innocently killed. The second to tell a story that the murder had been performed by a local group of Jews as a religious sacrifice of a Christian child during Passover. He chose to tell a story. And though the story seemed far-fetched and hard to believe, it eventually became the basis for one of the most heinous and lasting accusations against the Jews, that they conspired to kill children and use their blood for religious rites. The explanation for William's death that emerged, though slow to take hold in medieval England, became the mainstay of anti-Semitic thought and justification for atrocious crimes against Jews in the Middle Ages, and continues to this day. This accusation, often called the blood libel, didn't die with the Middle Ages. It has been made many times since. Jews were charged in mid-19th century Damascus with the death of a Christian monk, supposedly to use his blood in their rites. A 1913 indictment in Kiev alleged that the Jewish superintendent of a local brick factory had killed a 13-year-old at the start of Passover. Depictions of these supposed rites, some featuring Jews crowding around a corpse in their hunger and greed, others showing the lifeless bodies of innocent youths, appear in illustrations in stained glass. The accusations still happen today. In 2014, a Hamas spokesperson told a Lebanese television channel, quote, "We all remember how the Jews used to slaughter Christians in order to mix their blood in their holy matzos. This is not a figment of imagination or something taken from a film. It is a fact, acknowledged by their own books and by historical evidence." Close quote. One simple story had the power to create a lasting impression that today is considered to be a fact, acknowledged by historical evidence. It changed the perspective of the whole world. There are two sides to stories, just as there is to history. They can be both inspirational and injurious, motivating and malicious, heartwarming and hostile. Despite the misunderstandings that can come from stories, there is no way to ignore them. They tell the very story of civilization since the beginning of time, for every country has its own story, every religion, every family, and every person. The challenge of life is to find these stories and to remember them. Edmund Burke, an Irishman, is quoted to have said, "Those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it." Since the beginning of time, the human race has carried a curse that has been a part of every civilization since. This curse is our willingness to make the same mistakes that have been made since the beginning of time. This curse is our natural inclination to forget all the things we're supposed to remember. This is the story of history. There is sometimes a need, though, to repeat history, to repeat the actions of the young man Walter Scott, to confidently stand up against an empire like Cicero, to be as courageous as Corrie ten Boom was to hide Jews in her home in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands. We forget to be bold like Patrick Henry and as reverent as the pilgrims who cared so much about God they left everything behind to worship him in peace. We spend so much time preventing historical mistakes that we forget to learn and repeat the stunning things that have happened in the past. When telling people of my love of history, the response is sometimes, "History just really isn't my thing," as if people can decide whether they like to learn about history or not. Learning about history is our entire life, and if done properly can land you a gig like finding the crown jewels to a major country and being knighted. The word history has been associated with textbooks thousands of pages long and the memorization of pointless dates. History has been subjected to being nothing more than a subject, instead of the very fabric of life. There needs to be found a new and different way to communicate the lessons of the past to the current generation and to the generations that lie in the future. This way is through the telling of stories. Stories are credited with giving entire nations their identity. The story of the Iliad, an epic poem about impossible events, brought unity, purpose, and glory to both ancient Greece and the newer independent nation of Greece today. The epic poem of France during the time of Charlemagne, the Song of Roland, tells the story of winning a great fight, defending one's country, and doing your duty. In France's long history of the struggle for independence and liberty, a story of duty and heroics continues to lead and guide them today. The Kalevala of Finland contains the poetry, folklore, and stories passed down through generations and finally collected into their book of epic poetry. The country of Finland needed something to unite them, to give them a language and a shared history. All of these things were found in the national epic, the Kalevala. History is taught and remembered in the pages of these national stories, but to truly remember, understand, and learn from history, it is imperative that we know and remember our own story. Today, I wish to tell you a story. Not his story or her story or your story or even their story, but my story. The story of a Danish, English, German, French, American aspiring bagpipe player who has spent the better part of the last 10 years looking for the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe. The story of how I came to be a homeschooler in the American Midwest who plants comfrey and chamomile in the backyard to make homemade tinctures for medical emergencies. The story of years of experiences and actions worth repeating. The year was 1815. The place was England. Emperor Napoleon had only just regained his armies and was marching against his enemies. England was gathering its armies to stop him at Waterloo. Yes, the battle that the catchy ABBA song is written about. Thomas Harris was serving his beloved country of England as one of the king's soldiers. He was stationed at the barracks near his home, and his wife Lucy was able to visit him from time to time. In July of that year, Lucy, who was expecting their first child at any time, traveled the short distance to the barracks to see her husband. When she arrived, she was told Thomas was one of the soldiers that were sent to Waterloo to stop Napoleon's troops. Upon hearing the news, her baby decided that an army barrack was as good a place as any to make his grand entrance. She went into labor, and her first child, a son, was born. After just 2 weeks of recovery time, she strapped the babe to her back and started the journey of finding her husband. Weeks later, she found him sitting in a circle, talking with other soldiers. Shocked and relieved he was still alive, she slipped into the circle and placed the new baby on his lap. Both Thomas and Lucy showed remarkable patriotism, courage, and inspired into their children a love of family. It was their dedication to their country that would be passed on to their generations as they showed that same patriotism in America. Life in Denmark in 1845 was almost perfect. The weather in Denmark is mild and sunny. The soil is rich and green and perfect for farming. Living on the coast means you get to smell the salt coming off the sea every day and hear the sound of the waves crashing against the rocky shores. One farmer loved his life in Denmark. His name was Jens. He and his wife Anna owned acres of this beautiful land. There were a few guards or large farming estates which had been handed down from generation to generation to the oldest son. Jens knew the business of running the large farming estate. He kept many workers on the farm, including servants in their home. Anna's personality, determination, and executive eye for business made her a vital part of running the Vedum Gård, as the estate was called. Life was good, Denmark was beautiful, everything was perfect. In 1851, Christian missionaries arrived in Copenhagen and began preaching the gospel. Jens, inspired by their message, invited them gladly into his home and saw that every worker on his farm had the opportunity to hear their wonderful message. Almost all were converted. The official religion in Denmark at the time was Lutheran, and as time elapsed, it became clear that they would not be welcome in Denmark for long due to their beliefs. They desired to come to America, to be free, and to be with those that respected their beliefs. With no hesitation, Jens and Anna packed their bags and immediately made the preparations for more than 60 people to travel with them across the ocean to America. The monetary cost of paying for the passage of that many people was astronomical. The emotional cost of leaving their livelihood, land, and country was even more potent. On a chilly Sunday, April 6, 1862, they boarded the steamship Albion to begin their journey to America. They said goodbye to their family and friends and to their beloved country, with the knowledge that they would never see them again. As they sailed across the ocean, Jens became gravely ill. After only a few days of sickness, he died, and his body was buried in the ocean. Jens and Anna showed absolute consecration to God. They willingly gave up their money, their customs, and even their very country for what they believed in. These principles were not only taught to their children, but every life they influenced. A few years later, 3 Danish sisters, Caroline, Christine, and Nicoline, after more than 50 days spent on a ship on a turbulent sea, arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on the 31st of May, 1857. As soon as they got off the boat, they rushed to buy enamel flag pins that they wore with pride for the rest of their lives. As much love as they had for their beloved Denmark, they were Americans now and were proud to live in a country where they could be free. A young woman, Mette, took a different route from Denmark to get to what would eventually become Utah. While headed up the Mississippi River towards St. Louis, Missouri, cholera broke out among many people on the ship. It may be difficult for our modern-day minds, as a flu virus causes panic, to comprehend the life-threatening diseases that only existed mere decades ago. Cholera is an intestinal infection that can be passed through infected water or food. In an epidemic, the disease is usually spread to another person. Inadequate treatment of sewage and drinking water can cause the disease to spread rapidly. Without treatment, death can occur in hours. In the 1800s, the cause of the dreaded disease was still unknown, and the drinking water was anything but sanitary. All ships traveling from New Orleans were required to stop at a place called Quarantine Island. Here they were examined by doctors to find out if there were any infectious diseases on board. If they found any, the ship was placed in quarantine, and the sick were detained on the island. The ship's captain requested help to nurse the cholera victims aboard the ship. Meddy reluctantly went to assist the ill. She must have known that this service would likely cost her life. Before she left, she told her parents, "I will never return alive." She, a young woman of 22 years, became the victim of cholera and died. She was well and strong, but after being stricken, it took but 6 hours when she lay still and cold in death. Thousands of people from every part of Europe got on boats full of sick, suffering people, leaving behind everything they loved for things they believed in, for a history worth sharing with their descendants. Perhaps they believed that in leaving behind their culture, customs, habits, and very hearts, that those who followed would remember the national stories and traditions of their original homes. The story doesn't end with the arrival of these people in America. In the early 1900s, Shirley was born in Utah. Her father worked on the railroad for a meager wage, and while saving for a home, the family of 5 lived in a one-room chicken coop. When she was 15, she was on a ladder, washing the windows when her brother came outside and made her laugh. She immediately felt funny, and the next thing she knew, she was face down on the lawn. She would pass out at random times, especially when she would laugh. Her knees were always bruised from hitting the cupboards when she would fall asleep while doing the dishes. After marrying and having a few children, it was discovered that she suffered from narcolepsy. Despite her health problems, she was a fearless, energetic woman. The kind who went and bought vodka, hiding the bottles in the back of the car so her neighbors wouldn't think she was a drunk. After arriving home, she put the children to work, making herbal tinctures that, due to the alcohol, would last more than 20 years on the shelf for any future medical emergencies. After having her 9th child, Shirley discovered she had breast cancer. In an effort to slow the spread, it was determined that the arm would need to be amputated. Shirley, a lover of the piano, sat down at her beloved instrument the night before the surgery and played her favorite 12th Street rag, her children dancing to the music, clueless to the events of the coming day. She lost her left arm the next day. After becoming pregnant with her 10th child, the cancer was discovered in her entire body. The doctors wanted her to have an abortion so they could treat the cancer more effectively, but she would not have it. Just 6 months after delivering a boy who was healthy and strong, she passed away at the age of 42. In her final months of suffering, there was never a moment when she didn't have a smile on her face. One visitor said, "We went to cheer her up, but it was us who really was cheered." Occasionally, Shirley's 10 children, my mother being the 9th, gather together for sibling parties. Some siblings like to watch movies together or have a normal family dinner, but not this family, raised by such a unique mother. Well, on September 27th, 2015, all the siblings got together, and by all, I mean 4 of them. They obviously gather for these parties at our house because I make the best cookies. This party on September 27th, 2015, was no ordinary gathering. Scientists had said that that day would be the day of the solar eclipse, also known as a blood moon by all serious preppers and conspiracy theorists. In honor of this historic event, I had sunburned my face just the day before to get the color scheme going. I was very sunburned. Very, very sunburned. So sunburned that people were cooking fried eggs on me. So sunburned that a child accidentally touched me, and after his mother gave me a good talking to, was picked up by an ambulance for 3rd-degree burns. So sunburned that I lost a piece of my mind that day that hasn't returned. I stood there in the kitchen trying to prevent my clothes from smoking and making red velvet cupcakes for the occasion when my mother's siblings started to trickle in. They all made a good show of pointing out the second blood moon of the evening that was my face. They were only lucky that I couldn't speak due to my sunburned trachea. It finally became dark enough to see the moon. Now, a normal person would go outside and look at the moon, maybe take a few pictures, look through a telescope, and then wrap it up, go inside, and call it a day. Not my aunts and uncles. As we went outside, out came the books and the binders and the photos, the journal entries, all the evidence carefully gathered and collected over 10 years concerning the blood moon and its relation to the signs of the last days. So there we stood outside, them looking at maps, diagrams, and telescopes, me talking over them when a neighbor walked by and trying to make it look like we were doing normal things. After oohing and awing over the beautiful color of the moon, they packed up the evidence and studies, warmed their hands on my burnt flesh, had some red velvet cupcakes, and then went home. That was my first blood moon party, and I'm smart enough to know that there will likely be more in my future. My unique family history and upbringing has provided me the opportunity to have many different experiences. These unique experiences are what led to my unique, home-styled education. The life of a homeschooler is spent on many important and life-changing pursuits. For many kids, there is school, and then there is normal life. In homeschool, there is only life, and in that life, you learn. One of these significant, important learning lessons that I felt called to pursue was finding the greatest chocolate chip cookie recipe in the world. In January 2010, the online pin board Pinterest was created. Before the time of Pinterest, dinners were often accompanied by your great-great-grandmother's famous huckleberry pie. But since the creation of Pinterest, we have seen a serious increase in the uniqueness and variety of everyday desserts. For example, these days, a simple caramel, walnut, chocolate-dipped brownie cheesecake bar popsicle isn't too hard to believe. Despite this new idea of mashing all your favorite candy into one dessert, there is one classic food that will forever be unchanged by the pull of trends. This treasured classic is known today as the chocolate chip cookie. This cookie plays a very significant role in my life. Memories from some of my earliest days consist of standing on a kitchen chair, stirring butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, while my uncle supervised me from the side. This was repeated month after month and year after year as a tradition, whenever my uncle babysat. We always used Mrs. Field's Cookies No. 2, the best chocolate chip cookie recipe in the world. As time went on, the babysitting assistance of my uncle became unnecessary. Anxious to make my favorite treat, I pulled out the well-used Mrs. Field's recipe and made my favorite cookies. They came out of the oven too flat. Confused, I made them again. Not flat enough. Again, didn't taste right. I made that recipe over and over again, testing all sorts of crazy theories, desperate to find where I had gone wrong. Mixers versus wooden spoons, pure vanilla versus imitation vanilla, mixing for 5 minutes instead of 10. I even made the cookies once again under the direction of my uncle and with his supervision. They never were the same. This led me on a journey to find the perfect chocolate chip cookie. I've tried hundreds of recipes, scoured Pinterest for every last one they've had. I've had cookies in Paris, London, and New York City, and while there have been many mouth-watering, delicious, and even perfect cookies, there has never been Mrs. Field's Cookies No. 2. After a 7-year sugar rush and a diabetes scare for my cookie journey, I decided that conclusions needed to be made. I realized that I could never recreate the past, a seemingly obvious conclusion with our lack of experience in time travel. I realized that no amount of wishing or hoping or desiring could ever take me back to when I was 6 years old, with an undeveloped sense of taste, an appetite for all things sugar, and excitement that my grown-up uncle was willing to spend time with me. My love for Mrs. Field's Cookies No. 2 was in the memories. It was in the story, not the taste. Except it really is in the taste because I actually do love them. How have I tried so many different cookies around the world, you might ask? My cookie traveling journey began when my father was fired from his job in Dallas, Texas. Instead of being a normal, mature adult and finding a new job right away, we decided to postpone normalcy for a couple of months, pack our things into storage, and drive across the United States, camping along the way, learning how to be outdoor people. Of the many remarkable things we saw throughout the country, some of which include losing a flip-flop in the ocean off the coast of Maine, seeing where James Madison sat and studied in preparation for the Constitutional Convention, and jumping off a cliff into the frigid waters of Lake Superior, one of the greatest stories came from visiting the small town of Elmwood, Nebraska. When I was very young, my love of books was known far and wide. One day, while conversing with a very old woman, she looked me right in the eye and told me to read a book titled A Lantern in Her Hand by Bess Streeter Aldrich. When an old woman tells you to do something like that, you do it. A Lantern in Her Hand and all books by Bess Streeter Aldrich tell of the difficulties and challenges that early settlers faced when they moved to Nebraska in the early 1800s. Many were immigrants who had given up everything. Her books describe the hardship, but also the beauty of Nebraska, which is considered to be one of the flattest and deadest states in the nation. When driving across the country, I demanded we make a simple, easy, small, 12-hour detour in the most boring state in America to see where Bess lived and where she wrote. That's how we ended up in Elmwood, Nebraska one Saturday at 1:00 p.m. After cautiously approaching the door of a very old-looking house, an old man answered and looked very confused why a family was standing on the porch on the hottest day of the year in Elmwood, Nebraska, the most boring, lifeless city in America. I told him we were there to see the Bess Streeter Aldrich home. The next 2 hours were some of the greatest I have ever spent. He took us from room to room, telling us the story of life in Nebraska. He told us about the things that inspired Bess Streeter Aldrich's work. He told us about the simplicity of her life. The tour ended with the opportunity to purchase any of her books. Because of my book-buying addiction, I approached the register with a very high stack. So high, in fact, that he called the other members of the Bess Streeter Aldrich Preservation Committee and told them of my actions. That day, I left Elmwood, Nebraska, with arms full of books, and having seen and heard the life of a master storyteller who wrote some of the nation's greatest stories. Now I realize that you may think I've been sitting up here for 20 minutes talking about my life, and you're thinking that because that's exactly what happened. These are some of the stories and experiences that have brought me to where I am today. They are bizarre, strange, and completely unique, but that is my story. Though I have shared many experiences, these remain only a fraction of what makes up who I am. In my life story, there is patriotism, courage, hope, fear, faith, blood moons, and lots of cookies. Great inspiring stories guide civilizations and inspire the national identity of many countries, but it is our own personal stories that bring the most strength to us. Each and every person faces a great need to tell their story. Without the stories of the past, we fulfill the curse of constantly forgetting and never remembering. May we remember the words of the poet Rudyard Kipling. The tumult and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings depart. Still stands thine ancient sacrifice, a humble and a contrite heart. The tumult and the shouting are the great crises that have shaped our world today. They are the wars and trials that breed the heroes of history. The captains and the kings are the great figures from those turbulent times, the Winston Churchills, Abraham Lincolns, and George Washingtons. When they die, their memories and experiences die with them, just like ours die with us. And once they are gone, they are lost to the next generation. It is our responsibility, our duty, and our legacy to tell our history. The lessons, the trials, the good moments, the bad moments, the times when we cried or laughed or ate 46 cookies in one sitting, the times when we bought vodka for medicinal purposes, or when we wore an American flag pin our whole life to remind us of our national loyalty. If we don't tell the story, then the story never gets told, and is lost to the curse of human nature, forgetting. Our doom has a cure, and the cure is found in stories. Our hope is in our past. It is in the stories that have made us who we are. Whatever crises have happened in history, we have to remember the Lucys, who find their husbands in Waterloo despite fantastic odds. We have to remember Jens and his absolute willingness to leave everything behind. We have to remember to sit down and play our favorite rag piece instead of focusing on the cancer overtaking our bodies. These, among countless others, are the historical examples worth remembering, worth repeating. So, get the boxes of experiences from the attic of your mind, dust off the old shelves of your memories, and resurrect the story of your life. Talk about it, teach it, remember it. Let us tell stories that will last in our generation forever. May we share the same prayer that was said by the poet Rudyard Kipling. Lord of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget.